Okay, hello everyone. This is Colin Cox, and this is Modern American Literature. Today, I want to talk about F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, but I will spend most of this lecture discussing Fitzgerald's story, Babylon Revisited. Now, before I talk about the story, I want to foreground this particular moment in time in the same way or in a similar way to how I foregrounded the Harlem Renaissance. Because one of the things that I spoke about when I spoke about the Harlem Renaissance was how this was a moment in time, a brief moment in time where Black literature and perhaps just at large, Black art was having a moment. It flourished. And there is this sense that perhaps ground was gained during that period of the Harlem Renaissance. And I could complicate that, but just for now, I want us to imagine that ground was gained during the Harlem Renaissance. Well, for writers like Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, Virginia Woolf, Gertrude Stein, and I could just go on and on, there isn't that same sense that ground is gained. If anything, one of the words we could use, or one of the words I'll use quite often to describe this high modern movement, best defined by figures like F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway. I forgot to mention, for example, T.S. Eliot, James Joyce. It's this sense of loss. Loss is a word that I'll use quite often. And even Gertrude Stein defined this generation as the lost generation. And I'll talk about what that means because I think for someone like Stein, we need to be very particular about what a word like loss actually means, or what does it mean to be part of a lost generation. Well, if we take, for example, Babylon Revisited as an example, I think clearly what's lost, or for someone like Fitzgerald and characters like Charlie, it's the pleasure and the revelry of the roaring 20s that ended quite ceremoniously or unceremoniously with the stock market crash of 1929 and of course the depression that followed in the subsequent decade. But I think more broadly, what was also lost was this sense of security in the past, and even this sense that traditions and traditional values and superstitions perhaps still held sway in a modern world that, for legitimate reasons, embraced a kind of ambiguity. If you want to think about this period, modernism at large, and this is like all of the things I've said this semester, something of a broad, sweeping oversimplification, a word like ambiguity or the embracing of ambiguity was quite important. And another perhaps figure or quote that might help ground this in more specific terms is a philosopher named Friedrich Nietzsche, who wrote, and this is a direct quote from one of his books, The Gay Science: "God is dead, and we have killed him." And what Nietzsche ultimately means is not that we've literally killed God, but with the arrival of the modern period, we have created the conditions to find the sorts of superstition that allow for the presence of God. And what I mean by that is there is, especially with Christianity, this element of faith, of embracing not knowing with any real certainty, and that has this effect. But according to someone like Nietzsche, it's no longer enough to just say, trust the past, trust these superstitions. Things are not perhaps that clear and that certain. And with the rejection of perhaps certain traditional values, certain superstitions, faith, or the rejection of faith and the embrace of a kind of sobering scientific certainty, we get this sense of why someone like Stein would describe this generation as a lost generation because all of the old values, all of the old traditions that some would argue held society or held culture together, those values and those traditions, they just don't seem to work now in this new modern age. And it's also worth speaking about, and this is something if you read any of Ernest Hemingway's novels, The Sun Also Rises is a fantastic example. I would encourage you to read it if you haven't. The disillusionment following World War I, especially for those who fought in that war, helped to produce this sense that this is a lost generation. So with that as a kind of foundation, I think a lot of what Fitzgerald attempts to dramatize in Babylon Revisited makes a little more sense because Charlie, there is this feeling or this sensation that he's just wandering aimlessly in this world without any sense of how to correct his mistakes, forget the past, forget the horrors of his mistakes in the past. And because of that, Charlie is unmoored in a way that, again, seems impossible to correct. And that's part of the narrative of this story. Charlie desperately attempting to make good, or let me rephrase, Charlie attempting to correct his mistakes. And it's not a situation where he's incapable, but the past is something that won't remain in the past. It won't remain dormant. It continues to assert itself in ways that complicate Charlie's efforts to reform, but it's also an interesting and a sober reminder that the past, or at least I would argue this is part of what Fitzgerald wants to develop or dramatize. The past is something with a kind of agency, and despite all of our efforts to control it, we just can't. In many ways, we are controlled by our pasts, despite our efforts to assert control and agency over it. But let's spend a few minutes discussing these different parts of the story, because Fitzgerald organizes this story in a very clear, simple, and readable way, even though he does play with form at times. And again, there is this sense of fragmentation. I'll talk about that a lot as well, maybe more so with Hemingway, but there is this sense that Charlie's world, Charlie's mind, his psyche is deeply fragmented, and you can almost feel the form of the story, or the form the story takes, mirroring the fragmentation of Charlie's mind at times. But the story begins with a conversation. We begin in medias res, in the middle of something, and this is one of those times where I would encourage you to pay attention to, if not the first word, but what the opening of this story might possibly suggest about the rest of the story. So this is what Fitzgerald writes. "And where's Mr. Campbell?" Charlie asked. "Gone. To Switzerland. Mr. Campbell's a pretty sick man, Mr. Wells." So this actually reminds me of the opening to William Shakespeare's Hamlet, and the opening line to that play is, "Who's there?" And if you've read Hamlet, if you know anything about Hamlet, one of the more interesting themes in Hamlet is this idea of uncertainty, embracing not knowing, because Hamlet very much does that throughout the play. And we have that sense that uncertainty is an important theme for that play, with the opening line, a question, "Who's there?" which implies a lack of certainty. Here, Fitzgerald does something similar, I would argue, and it's this word, "gone." This sense that things are not as they were, that something's lost, something's gone. that carries throughout this story. And Fitzgerald beautifully introduces it here at the beginning as a way, again, of almost introducing a kind of thesis statement for this story, something that we should pay attention to as we continue reading. But there is this palpable sense of loss in this section. But that is not to say that Charlie has forgotten. I mentioned this before, how the past seems to have a kind of agency. In fact, it is this tension between loss, memory, and forgetting that makes the opening section of this story so interesting, because you could argue there is this sense that Charlie maybe wants to forget the past, or he wants to compartmentalize it, but he's incapable of doing so because of the power the past has. Notice, for example, what happens at the bottom of page 647, and I'll read directly from the book. This is Charlie just out walking the streets of Paris. As they rolled on to the left bank and he felt its sudden provincialism, he thought, I spoiled this city for myself. I didn't realize it, but the days came along one after another, and then 2 years were gone, and everything was gone, and I was gone. And notice the repetition of the word gone here. Again, Fitzgerald, he doesn't want us to mistake what this story is about. It is about that which is lost, that which has left, that which is gone. And even though maybe we don't quite understand the particulars of what happened to Charlie in the past, Fitzgerald does an interesting bit of foreshadowing. For example, if you look at the bottom of 468 and on to 469, we have a clear sense of perhaps Charlie's alcoholism, his difficulty with alcohol and how it may have negatively impacted him in the past. This is at the bottom of page 648. Don't you want a cocktail before dinner? Lincoln asked. I take only one drink every afternoon, and I've had that. I hope you keep to it, said Marion. So here, again, you'll notice there's a lot of subtlety, and there's a lot of work that we as readers need to do to infer what all of this might mean, because clearly there's this sense of hostility that Marion has or holds toward Charlie, and here Fitzgerald wants to connect it to perhaps his past alcohol abuse. But I think we can also see here on 649, again, this way that Fitzgerald wants his reader to understand the power the past and the power that memory has. And it just occurred to me a moment ago, I mentioned that Charlie was walking when he said, I spoiled this city for myself. He's actually in a taxi. My apologies. He is walking here, and this is again on 649, and I want to read a couple of paragraphs here, again, just as a way of grounding with the text this sense or this power that the past and that memory ultimately has. This is around the middle of the page. He passed a lighted door from which issued music and stopped with the sense of familiarity. It was Bricktops, where he had parted with so many hours and so much money. So again, what this also does, it's Fitzgerald doing an interesting bit of foreshadowing, giving us this sense of what we'll ultimately learn about Charlie, his frivolous behavior in the past. But then a little farther down the page, so much for the effort and ingenuity of Montmartre. All the catering to vice and waste was on an utterly childish scale. And he suddenly realized the meaning of the word dissipate, to dissipate into thin air, to make nothing out of something. In the little hours of the night, every move from place to place was an enormous human jump, an increase of paying for the privilege of slower and slower motion. He remembered 1,000-franc notes given to an orchestra for playing a single number, 100-franc notes tossed to a doorman for calling a cab, but it had been given for nothing. It had been given, even the most wildly squandered sum, as an offering to destiny, that he might not remember the things most worth remembering, the things that now he would always remember: his child taken from his control, his wife escaped to a grave in Vermont. So We see here Charlie reflecting on the futility of his behavior in the past. And it's particularly futile because Fitzgerald seems to think you cannot kill the past, despite Charlie's efforts. And there is this way that all of Charlie's futile attempts to forget, they have only deepened this sense of loss and tragedy. It's one thing to lose something you never wanted to lose. It's something, I suppose, entirely different to still lose that thing while aware that you also attempted to not remember the loss. And I think for Charlie here, again, we have this sense of how, even if we obviously don't agree with or sympathize with his behavior in the past, we have this sense of why someone like Fitzgerald wants to think of Charlie as a tragic figure, or how Fitzgerald would define the parameters of Charlie's tragedy. And as we transition into part two, we have a clearer sense of what Charlie lost. Apparently, he was wealthy once, but like so many of this generation, now he isn't. The notion that the past haunts is present in this section in interesting and thought-provoking ways as well. And we see here, for example, on 650, he's dining with his daughter, and it's interesting how adult she seems, how mature she seems, because she doesn't allow Charlie to indulge in perhaps any fantasies of what the past was. She is so unmistakably honest with him, brutally so near the end of this section. But she says here on 650, and we're not rich anymore, are we? Again, she seems to understand the particulars of Charlie's life in ways perhaps he wants to hide from others, or in ways he would like to forget, but his daughter will not allow him to forget. And then on 651, we see the past, again, manifesting, haunting Charlie, but it actually takes a palpable physical form here in these two characters, Duncan and Lorraine. And I'll just read here on 651. Suddenly, ghosts out of the past. Duncan Schaefer, a friend from college. Lorraine Corliss, a lovely pale blonde of 30, one of the crowd who had helped them make months into days in the lavish times of 3 years ago. My husband couldn't come this year, she said, in answer to his question. We're poor as hell. So he gave me $2,000 a month and told me I could do my worst on that. This your little girl? What about coming back and sitting down? Duncan asked. Can't do it. He was glad for an excuse, as always. He felt Lorraine's passionate, provocative attraction, but his own rhythm was different now. Well, how about dinner? She asked. I'm not free. Give me your address and let me call you. Charlie, I believe you're sober, she said judiciously. I honestly believe he's sober, Dunk. Pinch him and see if he's sober. Charlie indicated Honoria with his head. They both laughed. What's your address? Said Duncan skeptically. He hesitated, unwilling to give the name of his hotel. I'm not settled yet. I'd better call you. We're going to see the vaudeville at the Empire. There, that's what I want to do, Lorraine said. I want to see some clowns and acrobats and jugglers. That's just what we'll do, Dunk. We've got to do an errand first, said Charlie. Perhaps we'll see you there. All right, you snob. Goodbye, beautiful little girl. Goodbye, Honoria bobbed politely. Somehow, an unwelcome encounter. Somehow an unwelcome encounter. They liked him because he was functioning, because he was serious. They wanted to see him because he was stronger than they were. Now, because they wanted to draw a certain sustenance from his strength. There's a clear sense of tension in this interaction between Charlie and, again, the past manifest, or the past as represented by figures like Duncan and Lorraine. There's perhaps that same level of subtlety. Charlie clearly doesn't want either Duncan or Lorraine to say anything too particular about their misdeeds in the past, and just thinking about what it may have looked like, or what it may look like for Charlie to navigate this encounter, to navigate this interaction. You've maybe had moments like this as well, when human beings interacted with one another, when you saw someone from your past and you clearly wanted to just leave them and perhaps that conversation, that interaction in the past, and maybe you felt yourself tiptoeing around them in some way, afraid they might say something, reveal something, disclose something. And I think Charlie has a similar sort of reaction to meeting Duncan and Lorraine. He's again, but I think what's important is these are not just two arbitrary characters. They are in many ways a representation and manifestation of the past, a past that Charlie wants to forget, a past that Charlie has attempted to forget, but he simply cannot. And they almost embody this sense that the past has a kind of agency. It can just funnel or channel itself into particular people, particular characters, and it returns and haunts Charlie, because I think what's also interesting is there's no sense that either Duncan or Lorraine have any misgivings about their past in the same way Charlie does. In fact, you can actually see them needling him a little for his sobriety, which suggests they are not sober, and perhaps it suggests they even think or interpret his sobriety as something perhaps silly, frivolous, unnecessary. And the final thing I want to say about this section, again, thinking back to Charlie's initial, or our initial encounter with Honoria, here on 652, Charlie, he says this thing that I have the sense fathers say a lot, perhaps in particular to their daughters, especially if they're more traditional fathers. And what's interesting is how Honoria doesn't say what perhaps he wants or expects. And it's here near the bottom of the section. Of course I do, but you won't always like me best, honey. You'll grow up and meet somebody your own age and go marry him and forget you ever had a daddy. To which she replies, yes, that's true. She agreed tranquilly. So notice here, again, we're getting this sense, this inevitable eventual loss, but it's interesting how Honoria does not seem nearly as troubled as Charlie is about the prospect of the past and what the past might ultimately represent. Because just pay attention to what he suggests here. He's ultimately suggesting that at some point, I will be your past and you will successfully move on from me. She doesn't, again, say what perhaps he wants her to say, but she also doesn't adopt a posture that's similar to the one he's adopted thus far in the story, which is to say, she doesn't seem to think that it will be a problem under any circumstances to forget her past, to transcend her past. It'll just be something as simple as leaving an old toy behind, or leaving a childish trinket behind. So notice how there's this clear contrast between Charlie and how he orients himself to his past, and his daughter Honoria and how she predicts she'll orient herself to her past. So now let's talk about part 3. And again, here we learn, for example, that Helen died, and she died quite prematurely. And we also learned that Charlie spent a bit of time in a sanatorium. So again, we see the past rushing back unexpectedly and at times quite aggressively. At other times, however, the past is a source of comfort, but this sense that the past is comfortable or comforting, that ends rather quickly. That idea, that feeling, that sensation, it doesn't stay, it doesn't remain too long. Oh, and if I haven't said so, we also have this sense on 653 that Charlie, or again, this is an illusion that we'll learn more about later, that Charlie was somehow responsible or culpable in Helen's death. But here on 654, we have this moment when Charlie attempts to advocate for himself as a figure of reformation. But once again, notice how Charlie is incapable, or it's impossible for Charlie to speak positively about himself without making reference to the past. So again, the past and the present. Notice how for someone like Fitzgerald, for a character like Charlie, they are intimately entwined. And this is the middle of the page, 654. I don't blame Marion, Charlie said slowly, but I think she can have entire confidence in me. I had a good record up to 3 years ago. Of course, it's within human possibilities. I might go wrong any time. But if we wait much longer, I'll lose Honoria's childhood and my chance for a home. He shook his head. I'll simply lose her, don't you see? Yes, I see, said Lincoln. Why didn't you think of all this before? Marion asked. I suppose I did, from time to time, but Helen and I were getting along badly. When I consented to the guardianship, I was flat on my back in a sanatorium, and the market had cleaned me out. I knew I'd acted badly, and I thought if it would bring any peace to Helen, I'd agree to anything. But now it's different. I'm functioning. I'm behaving damn well, so far as, please don't swear in my house, Marion said. So, again, notice how it's impossible, it seems, for Charlie to extricate himself from his past misdeeds or just the past at large. And I'll skip over here to page 655 because we finally learn, or we have this sense of what happened between Charlie and Helen a few years ago that led to her death. And this is at the bottom here of page 655. But back in his room, he couldn't sleep. The image of Helen haunted him. Again, that word haunt, the past, again, just manifesting itself as something terrifying, something that haunts. Helen, whom he had loved so until they had senselessly begun to abuse each other's love, tear into shreds. On that terrible February night that Marion remembered so vividly, a slow quarrel had gone on for hours. There was a scene at the Florida, and then he attempted to take her home. And then she kissed young Webb at a table. After that, there was what she had hysterically said. When he arrived home alone, he turned the key in the lock in wild anger. How could he know she would arrive an hour later alone? That there would be a snowstorm in which she wandered about in slippers, too confused to find a taxi. Then the aftermath, her escaping pneumonia by a miracle, and all the attendant horror. They were reconciled, but that was the beginning of the end, and Marion, who had seen with her own eyes and who imagined it to be one of many scenes from her sister's martyrdom, never forgot. Going over it again brought Helen nearer, and in the white, soft light that stills upon half-sleep near morning, he found himself talking to her again. She said that he was perfectly right about Honoria and that she wanted Honoria to be with him. She said she was glad he was being good and doing better. She said a lot of other things, very friendly things, but she was in a swing, in a white dress, and swinging faster and faster all the time, so that at the end he could not hear clearly all that she said. One of the first things I'll mention, this memory of Helen, even though Charlie seems to think of it as something that haunted him. It's not all negative. There's actually something, or there are these nice moments as Charlie remembers her or has this fantasy image of her. And what's interesting is Helen in this story fits within this literary trope, and it's something that I'll mention a couple of contemporary examples. If you are familiar with the Taken film series starring Liam Neeson, you know that those films are predicated on this idea that perhaps a young woman, I think it's his daughter, someone takes her, and the potential for her death or some sexual deviant behavior enacted upon her, which I haven't seen them. I just know about them. Maybe that does happen, and my apologies if it does and I didn't mention it. But the point is, all of that really motivates this male protagonist. If you've ever seen the Russell Crowe film, The Gladiator, you know that it has a similar sort of narrative trajectory. Braveheart, also quite similar. And what you see in all of these stories is how female characters don't really have any agency whatsoever. They're not even really characters. They're more like MacGuffins. They're more like those little stones that Thanos collects in those Avengers movies. And Helen, she falls similarly within that category, but in this very specific subgenre of that broad literary trope called the lost Lenore. And this is a reference to one of Edgar Allan Poe's poems, The Raven. If you are, for example, familiar with the Harry Potter series, you know that Harry's mother, Lily, is very much a lost Lenore figure because she has this way of manifesting back into the story at times to encourage or propel or help the protagonist, Harry, learn important pieces of information. And we can see Helen functioning in a similar sort of way here. There's no sense of Helen as a full or complete character. She is, in particular, in the mind of Charlie, who is our point of view character, she is a kind of motivation for him. So I think that's also something that's interesting in this story as well. What Fitzgerald does with this dead female character who has this effect at times of haunting in a very terrifying way our protagonist or our point of view character, but she also motivates him in interesting ways, and how that renders her, not just in this story, but perhaps more often than not in the history or the trajectory of Western literature and Western literary sensibilities, how it renders her as something of an underdeveloped character who lacks any real agency. Again, thinking of her as maybe just a MacGuffin, a thing to have, a thing to hold or possess, like those stones in those Avengers movies. So I think something else maybe worth thinking about with this story is, well, what does Fitzgerald do with Helen as a character? Even though she's dead, she still has an outsized influence. She still has a presence in this story in ways that perhaps you would like to write about or think about. Anyway, I just wanted to mention it. I think it's something worth considering. Now, as we transition to part 4, we once again see the past. It becomes this active and destructive force. We see this clearly with the opening paragraph, but the past manifests itself at the end of the story as well. Unfortunately for Charlie, he cannot outrun or correct his past. And I think, again, here at the beginning of this section, we have a very clear sense of this story's and perhaps even Fitzgerald's attitude toward the past and what the past ultimately represents. And I'll just read this opening paragraph for section 4 here on page 656. He is Charlie, woke up feeling happy. The door of the world was open again. He made plans, vistas, futures for Honoria and himself. But suddenly he grew sad, Remembering all the plans he and Helen had made, she had not planned to die. The present was the thing, work to do and someone to love, but not to love too much, for he knew the injury that a father can do to a daughter or a mother to a son by attaching them too closely. Afterward, out in the world, the child would seek in the marriage partner the same blind tenderness and, failing probably to find it, turn against love and life. So, even though Charlie, in that opening sentence to this paragraph, even though Charlie had this moment of serenity, this moment where he felt good, notice what thoughts of the past do. They have this effect of corrupting even this nice, sublime, serene moment. And again, while this is perhaps not material, this is just an idea or a thought or a feeling happening in Charlie's imagination. We see the past manifest itself in a very material way near the end of this section. And it's this moment on 658 and 659 when Duncan and Lorraine, they crash this dinner that Charlie, Lincoln, and Marion are having. And if I haven't spoken about this nearly enough, but there is this sense throughout the story that Marion, even though she has some reservations, she's softening to the idea that Honoria and Charlie can reunite, that Charlie can become or return to being her guardian. And this encounter, again, this intrusion of Duncan and Lorraine throws all of that, for lack of a better phrase, to shit. And this is on 658. They were gay, they were hilarious, they were roaring with laughter. For a moment, Charlie was astounded, unable to understand how they ferreted out the Peters address. Ah, Duncan wagged his finger roguishly at Charlie. Ah, they both slid down another cascade of laughter. Anxious and at a loss, Charlie shook hands with them quickly and presented them to Lincoln and Marion. Marion nodded, scarcely speaking. She had drawn back a step toward the fire. Her little girl stood beside her, and Marion put an arm about her shoulder. With growing annoyance at the intrusion, Charlie waited for them to explain themselves. After some concentration, Duncan said, "We came to invite you out to dinner. Lorraine and I insist that all this shushy, cagey business about your address got to stop." Charlie came closer to them as if to force them backward down the corridor. And I'll stop there and I would encourage you to pay close attention to this lovely visual metaphor of Charlie trying to push them down. There is this sense that Charlie, he wants to do the exact same thing with the past, but as I've mentioned before in this lecture, the past has a kind of power and agency, and Charlie, frankly, has no control over it. And after Lorraine and Duncan finally leave, I'll jump over to page 659. This is near the end of this section when it's quite clear that Charlie has lost all of the goodwill that he has cultivated through this kind of diplomacy with Marion. It's clear what will ultimately happen. "I wish you'd explain to her I never dreamed these people would come here. I'm just as sore as you are. I couldn't explain anything to her now." Charlie got up. He took his coat and hat and started down the corridor. Then he opened the door of the dining room and said in a strange voice, "Good night, children." Honoria rose and ran around the table to hug him. "Good night, sweetheart," he said vaguely, and then, trying to make his voice more tender, trying to conciliate something, "Good night, dear children." So I think the question may be worth asking because this is functionally the end of the story. But I think the question, or one of the questions worth asking is, well, what do we think Fitzgerald's attitude toward the the past, and in particular, for any individual, a past just brimming with mistakes, what's the possibility, or is there a possibility for reformation? Are we always defined by our past mistakes? Is that contingent on the mistakes we make? Are some mistakes so bad they're rendered just unforgivable by the harmed parties? But I think another question worth considering is, well, what place does the past have in our lives? Because I think, and I've mentioned this several times throughout this lecture, for a character like Charlie, the past, while at times is a source of comfort, but it's more of a fantastical past. Think about, again, this idea of talking to Helen. Maybe this isn't the past. Maybe this is just taking someone out of the past and reconfiguring them in this fantastical way and having them interact with you in the present. But for someone like Charlie, it seems as if the past is always something that haunts. It's always something that is negative. It's something to be forgotten, but the irony is that he can't actually forget it. And if you want an interesting contemporary example, think of a movie. If you haven't seen it, I would encourage you to think of a movie like Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. And it's a movie from, at this point, maybe 20 years ago or so. It stars Kate Winslet and Jim Carrey. And it's this movie about these two people who had a relationship, and because of modern technology, and it's worth saying the relationship ended badly, they were able to erase the past. And this is something the movie introduces quite early, so I'm not necessarily spoiling anything. But what I think is interesting about a movie like that, especially when thinking about a story like Babylon Revisited, is how both that movie and this story, in effect, argues it doesn't matter what you do, the past will always return. And you are always left, or at some point, you will need to reckon with the past. And I think the question that Marion in particular asks Charlie quite often in this story, or the question, and it's less of a direct question and maybe more of an idea that she wants him to ponder, is, well, have you thoroughly reckoned with the past? And we understand why someone like Marion would be skeptical of Charlie, because he even though we don't see his behavior from the past, we have a sense of what it probably looked like. And that helps to explain why someone like Marion is perhaps so skeptical of him. But I think Fitzgerald actually wants us to think that Charlie has reckoned with his past. He has considered thoroughly and dispassionately the fragments of this horrifying past, and that he is in good faith attempting to reconfigure this fragmented life of his. But everything seems to some degree beyond his control. Even when a figure like Charlie attempts to do the right thing, he's simply incapable of doing so. And this is not like a play such as Oedipus the King by Sophocles, where Oedipus's decisions in the present create the conditions for his future failure. For someone like Charlie, Fitzgerald seems to suggest that there's actually nothing he can do in the present to positively affect his future. It's all a matter of just chance and circumstance. He seems quite powerless. Not only powerless in the face of figures like Lincoln and Marion, who have legal rights to his daughter, but powerless in the face of this unwieldy past that haunts his present and that seems, if we pay attention to Section 5, will continue to haunt his future. Because the story ends with a reference to that which is gone, that which is lost, Charlie's wife, Helen. He would come back someday. They couldn't make him pay forever, but he wanted his child, and nothing was much good now beside that fact. He wasn't young anymore, with a lot of nice thoughts and dreams to have by himself. He was absolutely sure Helen wouldn't have wanted him to be so alone. So here at the end, with Charlie perhaps pondering what his future looks like, acknowledging and understanding that he's not a young, naive, perhaps idealistic person, we have this impression, or we have this sense that Charlie is just the lost generation embodied or personified, because the final word of the story is alone. He's adrift, he's fragmented, he's completely dislocated. And yeah, okay, I think that's all I want to actually say about the story. I think I've given you a lot to think about, I hope at least. And this recording has gone a bit longer than I intended, so here's what I might do. I'll just release this as part A, and if I have some time over the weekend, I'll record a little something about the Ernest Hemingway story I asked you to read. It won't be as long, but I'll at least make an effort to do that and make it available to you at some point over the weekend. So I hope you have a great week and a great weekend. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. Again, this is Colin Cox for Modern American Literature.